Hello everyone, welcome to the presentation today on forced migrant youth reconstructing their identity, belonging, and future. My name is Debra. I am a graduate student in the Department of Psychology, and I am speaking to you from Lekwungen territories today. Was born and raised on the traditional homelands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Mississaugas of the First Credit, which to some is known as Toronto. I am a third-generation immigrant here in Canada. My grandparents arrived as refugees. They had escaped World War II in Hungary and arrived here. And my intersections of identity as a Jewish Canadian cisgendered woman have very much influenced the way in which I interact and do research on youth migration. And facilitating with me today is Dr. Jessica Ball, my supervisor, who will say a few words about herself too.
Hi, I'm Jessica Ball. I'm a professor in the School of Child and Youth Care here at the University of Victoria. I'm a third-generation Irish and English settler. I have had the privilege of teaching at the university, which is on the traditional territories of the Lekwungen-speaking people. And I have raised my family, my son and my daughter, with my husband on the stolen lands of the Sayout First Nation. And I'm looking forward to sharing our presentation today.
So yes, both Jessica and I would like to acknowledge the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. And we both feel it's especially important to keep this acknowledgement in mind today as we talk to you about forced migration in light of the ongoing oppression of Indigenous people in Canada who have been denied the right to own their own land that they have lived on pre-colonization, to govern their land. And while the experiences of forced migrants are different, they too have experienced displacement and have been denied the right to survive and thrive on their homelands. And so we also have to consider the number of immigrants and newcomers and refugees who have arrived here on Canada on Indigenous lands and have benefited from colonial laws and regulations like my ancestors as well. And so as we talk about forced migration and displacement today what is happening overseas in Malaysia and Thailand, we also have to keep in mind what's happening here in Canada with respect to oppression and displacement of Indigenous peoples here in our own backyard.
So I'd like to introduce the team members for our project. Over the years since 2016, there have been 15 students at the University of Victoria who've been involved in our project, as well as a number of people in Malaysia and Thailand. Pictured in our slides today are our current team members. Chris Say, he is a graduate of the School of Social Work here at the University of Victoria, currently working with youth in the Yukon. Also pictured here is Rasheen Lamuchi. Rasheen came to Canada as a refugee from Iran 10 years ago and is currently working on her master's in child and youth care and is located in Toronto. Parity Thorson in the bottom left of the slide is from Thailand. She's currently working with Indigenous people in Australia. Angela Dim is a Lahu and Karen refugee from Myanmar. She currently lives in Thailand. And Debra and myself. So we'd like to just give you a little outline of what we're going to cover in our presentation today. First, we're just going to give you a little bit of a sense of the current landscape of migration around the world. We'll talk about youth and refugee rights. We'll talk about our research and about what research in general about migration says. And when we're talking about our project, we'll go over what our key research questions are, the methods that we're using, and our findings to date. It is an ongoing study. And then we'll talk about our next steps. So what or who comes to mind when you hear the words forced migrant? So we'd like to talk about some important terms when we're considering the issue of migration and mobility. First of all, who is an asylum seeker? An asylum seeker is a person who is waiting for their refugee claim to be recognized and processed by the country to which they've submitted it. So they're sometimes called refugee claimants. Forced migrants are people who have been displaced from their home, either across borders or within their country, for various reasons, most often because of armed conflict, environmental disasters, persecution, exploitation, or other factors that have pushed them to leave their country or they've been ejected from their country. One of the things that many people are not aware of is that not all forced migrants have refugee status. In fact, a minority of forced migrants around the world actually ever achieve refugee status. So refugees have legal status under international law, and not all forced migrants are granted this status. Now, in the migration landscape, there are a minority of people who are actually stateless. So not all forced migrants and refugees are stateless, but some refugees and forced migrants are stateless. And that means that they are denied or not granted citizenship by any country. Now, this flies in the face of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to which most countries have signed on. And that declaration states that everyone has the right to a nationality. Okay, so this slide is an illustration of the numbers of people that are moving around the world today. And we are at a time where there are unprecedented high rates of people who are migrating. 70.8 million people have been forcibly displaced and are forced migrants. 41.3 million are internally displaced within their own country. 25.9 million are refugees, that is, they have refugee status. And there are an estimated 3.5 million who are asylum seekers. Now, although this illustration does show asylum seekers, it is well understood that this diagram is a gross underrepresentation of the total numbers of forced migrants around the world who have sought asylum. That is, they've sought to have their claim to refugee status honored, but have been denied, or they haven't been able to initiate a claim yet. So some people estimate that there may be twice as many people on the move as in various states of forced migration and refugee status at this time. So the next slide shows, this is a map of the world that highlights Myanmar in the navy blue, and then two red countries there showing Thailand and peninsular Malaysia and eastern Malaysia. And we've highlighted those on the map because those are the two sites. Thailand and Malaysia are the two sites where we're focusing our research. And it's interesting to note that Myanmar has generated the third highest number of forced migrants worldwide. Over 1 million people have been ejected from Myanmar over the past 20 years. A majority of those people have fled to Bangladesh, but there are also a large number of those people that have fled to Thailand and Malaysia.
So to address the needs of those who have been displaced, there are a number of international laws that protect the rights of refugees. And then also related to our work, there are a number of international laws to protect the rights of children. So in 1951, there was the Refugee Convention, which is also known as the Geneva Convention. And this defined who is a refugee. and outlined the legal protections and human rights and social protections that were owed to refugees by the states and countries that had signed on to this agreement. Malaysia and Thailand are two countries where our research takes place that has not signed on to this agreement. And you can see here on this map that the countries that are in green and orange have signed on to the 1951 Refugee Convention or to its expanded protocol in 1967. But a handful of countries, largely across Southeast Asia, have not ratified this agreement. And this has significant implications for the forced migrants who reside within those borders. In addition, there is the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and it outlined 42 different rights that children deserve to have. And importantly, in the context of refugees and forced migrant youth, this includes identity documentation, like having a passport and a right to a name. And this is something that is often not recognized or granted to individuals who are on the move and do not have legal status. It also talks about living free from war, persecution, and violence, and also to have a right in decisions, like to have a voice in decisions that impact forced migrant youth and all youth. And yet we know that youth's voices are rarely heard in policy. And Malaysia and Thailand, they have agreed to the UN CRC. Actually, all countries except for the United States have agreed to this, and this has important implications for understanding our work, which I'll talk about in a bit as well. So yeah, in addition to the UN CRC, Malaysia and Thailand have signed on to the Sustainable Development Goals. These are goals that were set out in 2015 by the UN to be achieved by 2030. And we just want to highlight 3 of these goals that are pertinent to our work, and these are quality education, reduced inequalities, and peace and justice. And in order for the world to achieve the SDGs, such as universal access to quality education, they need to provide these services and these rights to all people within their borders. And so, for example, while Malaysia may be working towards providing better quality education to youth, by excluding refugee and forced migrant youth, it actually threatens their realization of achieving the SDGs. And this is true for Thailand as well. So Malaysia and Thailand, they have agreed to the UNCRC and the SDGs, but they have not ratified the UN Refugee Convention. And this is important. You can see in that top picture that that's a school in Malaysia that's providing state-of-the-art education to youth, to its citizens. And then the bottom 2 pictures show the site where our research takes place, and that's a not-for-profit organization in Malaysia that provides informal education to refugee youth. And they are significantly underfunded, and as a result, don't have the same means, the same infrastructure. And so what this means is that only some youth are getting rights in Malaysia, and not all, and especially refugee youth are left out from this. So in addition to looking at what's happening at the policy level, as a research team, we of course had to know what's happening in terms of what we know about forced migrant youth within research. So when we looked at the research, we have found that knowledge about youth development, and especially youth identity development, tends to be heavily Western-centric. So that means that developmental theories about how youth grow up in the world and understand themselves is often rooted in Western research taken from Western samples, and the research that is done with refugee and newcomer youth is often done with youth who have resettled in countries like the US, Canada, Britain, and generally this research has lacked contextualization within diverse cultures, and particularly within the global south or majority world countries. And even more so, we know so little about youth who are in transit, who have not resettled and are kind of between their home countries and that place of resettlement. Also, constructions of forced migrant youth have typically portrayed them as passive, helpless victims. And so we don't want to underscore the level of vulnerability that these youth experience in their journey. And, we can think back to images like Alan Kurdi, who was a Kurdish 3-year-old boy who drowned and unfortunately washed up on the shore of a beach in Turkey. And those experiences are really heart-wrenching and sad. And also, we still have to understand that these youth have agency and a voice, even within their constraints and in light of the ongoing oppression they face, and we have to hear those perspectives as well. And youth's voices are not heard in research in the same way we're not hearing youth's voices in policy. And what this means is that the needs and goals of forced migrant youth often are assumed by migrant-serving organizations and by other adults like caregivers or other people who might be working in this field. And so our research sought to address this gap and find out from forced migrant youth how they understand their identities, how they negotiate belonging, and how they determine what their future aspirations will be in light of their forced migration experiences.
So it's interesting to linger on this slide and look at what we call the storyboard that was produced by this adolescent girl from Sudan. Speaking of wanting to hear about youth voices, you can see on this storyboard a giant microphone. And, she was very, very engaged in the project because she understood that this might be a chance for youth voices to be heard. Also on the storyboard, if you go from clockwise from the upper left, you see that she has the flag of Sudan, her country of origin, and an image of her family. And most of the youth did talk about the importance of their family and trying, if they could, to stay together with their family, to move with their family, and not wanting to move forward into the future without at least some of their family members. So she shows her family of origin, her country of origin, going on the plane and arriving in Malaysia. And then if we go around the circle there clockwise, you see a giant hospital. And this is her representation. She talked a lot about wanting to become a doctor and to, in the future, to be able to help people. Many of the youth talked about wanting to find a role in their future where they could be helpful to other people, especially people like themselves who are forced migrants or who are from their country of origin. So you see the giant hospital there as one of her future aspirations, and then the beautiful bright pink house, the bright green windows is her hope for having a lovely home envisioned sometime in her future. So we'd like to share with you our project goals. So the key research questions, the main thing was we wanted to know how youth describe and explain their experience of forced migration and how that experience is reshaping their sense of who they are or their identity, their sense of where they belong or where is home, and their hopes for their future and how those hopes may have been changed as a result of their new circumstances. So we're asking, what do forced migrant youth say that they need in order to cope with ongoing oppression? Because many of the youth said that their feelings of discrimination, of being socially excluded, and of having a high degree of uncertainty in their lives gave them a feeling of oppression that was ongoing. So just having fled from their country of origin where things were very difficult for them did not mean that their extremely difficult circumstances had ended. We want to know what they say about how they experience their socio-emotional wellness and what they need in order to thrive and attain their future aspirations. So for this project, we created a brand new method, which we call the peer-mediated storyboard narrative method. It's a bit of a mouthful, but it's been very exciting to see how this method has been working and how much the youth are attracted to it. And so because these are youth and because they're in very impoverished environments, we wanted to create a method that would be really appealing to them and that they would enjoy, and also that they might be able to learn new skills. And so it's an arts-based expressive method, and it's a peer-mediated storyboard narrative method in which individuals and groups, individuals get into groups and interview each other. Each youth is given a kit of low or no-cost art supplies and a large poster board, or in Malaysia we used large foam core boards, as you saw in the previous slide. And then they're given some questions to ponder. For example, how has migrating changed your sense of who you are, your sense of where you belong, and your sense of what might be possible in your future or your future goals? The youth get together in self-selected small groups of 4 to 8 young people called the peer groups. And the peers, they take turns in their peer groups presenting their storyboards. And then the peers ask the youth who's told their story, their storyboard narrative, ask the youth questions. They may make comments. They may comment on something that they've experienced, a common experience of their journey with their family, or something in common in terms of what's going on with their families at home, or their experiences of moving about in the community of Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia. So we're interested in the kinds of questions that peers ask each other, rather than having interviewer-driven, like researcher-driven questions. We thought it would be interesting, what would peers ask each other if they were given a chance to just have an open-ended discussion? And then the youth's narratives, as well as the questions that the peers ask, are audio taped and transcribed. And then these transcripts serve as the primary data for our study. The participants in our study, well, we really have 3 phases to the research. Phase 1 is focused in Malaysia, and we have completed this phase. We did the peer-mediated storyboard narrative method with 40 youth who were from North African and Middle Eastern countries, as well as with 12 Rohingya youth from Myanmar. In phase 2, which we're just in the beginning now, we'll be engaging with approximately 30 Rohingya or Burmese Muslim youth living on the border between Thailand and Myanmar. And then in phase 3, we're going to be doing an intervention trial where we're going to explore the potential of the storyboard method with forced migrant youth as a form of psychosocial support and a way of helping youth develop perhaps greater self-insight and a chance to kind of make meaning and give some order to the kind of chaotic forced migration experience that they've had. We will also do an intervention trial in Malaysia if we're able to find funding to do that.
So now we're going to share some of our findings to date. This is based off of the youth who participated in Malaysia and the Rohingya youth as well in the phase 1. So yeah, one of the main comments that we heard from youth is that fleeing does not grant youth and their families safety and security. So while we may think these youth have fled from dangerous circumstances from war, they continue to face new forms of unsafety and precarity in Malaysia. So youth relayed that one of the major challenges was that their families were not able to work legally. And so this meant they either had to work illegally and faced this risk of deportation and detention if they were caught by police, and that did happen to youth at times, or they had to not work at all, and then in those circumstances especially, they had no income. And that made it really hard to afford basic needs like food and healthcare. And in that way, their physical safety was compromised in Malaysia as well. They also faced ongoing discrimination and exclusion from society. They heard narratives about how migrants were not welcome in Malaysia. They were not, allowed to play sports at times, like the fields were restricted to them. And so all of a sudden, youth had to negotiate these discriminatory narratives and figure out how that fit with who they were and how to respond to that. And youth had to abandon some of their hopes and dreams that they had felt, were achievable in their home countries, what they were going to do if they had stayed there. And this meant renegotiating what they were going to do now that they were in Malaysia. For some, this led to feelings of hope because they had different opportunities in Malaysia that they felt they could take advantage of, new ways of seeing the world, having met new people. And for other youth, understandably, this led to a sense of loss over what could have been. So I'll now share some quotes. As I mentioned, this challenges related to a lack of status was something that came up very frequently. So you can see here this youth from Myanmar said, "I'm a refugee, my brother is a refugee. He almost finished school, but he cannot go to school because he doesn't have the ID, passport, also money. Now he is in the house, he don't have a job." And then another girl who was a little older, 15 years old, from Myanmar said, "We are an asylum seeker. My father cannot work. We cannot work because police can catch us. It's really hard. My father has been captured by the police a few times." And so that just shows the level of fear and worry that these youth were experiencing on a daily, ongoing basis. Some conveyed hopelessness and distress. "I feel in jail in Malaysia. I feel like I'll die if I stay here another year." And then others talked about the discrimination that I referenced earlier. They heard things like, "You're a problem, a refugee. You're like this. You're like that. You're not like us." I just want to know what they mean by "you're not like us." And that was a 13-year-old girl from Iraq who said that. Youth had different ideas of what home meant to them, just depending on how they looked at it. So some youth redefined home as family. If my family is complete, that is my home. Other youth looked at home as more of a physical place and felt like it was this tenuous prospect for them. I really don't know where home is. Malaysia, we are not here forever, so I don't consider this as home. Afghanistan, I don't really remember much about my country. So also, it is not home. As we talked about before, some youth were hopeful and kind of renegotiated new dreams in light of living in Malaysia. So this girl from Sudan said, "My dream is to complete my education, then to become a UN employee because I know how it feels to be an immigrant." And another girl from Afghanistan said, "I think meeting new people helped me gain confidence. Here, there are people from different races, different countries, different colors. In Afghanistan, you don't see much, but here, when you come out of your comfort zone, you definitely see other races and you become open-minded." And so for her, that led to feeling like she had new opportunities. So we're now going to play for you a spoken word poem that was written by our team member, Christopher Tse, who was in Malaysia and speaking with these youth, and he wrote about his experience with them.
"There are bars on this place," she tells me. Like the kinds they put on shop windows. In this birdcage of a country, this broken dream that asks us why we are here, screams at us on the bus, tells us to go back to our country in the grocery store. The walls of humidity envelop us like a bear hug we never consented to. Sticky September nights spent swatting mosquitoes and shushing our siblings. Dad's sleeping. Dad's got to wake for work by 4. It's easier to duck immigration police that early. Across the room, a cockroach lumbers up the wall looking for a way out of here. There's no food in this house anyway. The wet, hot heat of this country is like hell, she says. Or maybe purgatory. At least in hell you know you're there to stay. Here, we don't know anything. Except that when the rain comes in monsoon bursts, the holes in our shoes remind us we cannot afford new ones. And when the sun returns to steam the sidewalks, it reminds us we cannot afford air conditioning. And when the dengue hits our little brothers, we remember we cannot afford medicine. No hospitals here want refugee patients unless we come with cash. They told us this country would be better than those that we left, but so far this freedom feels as far as the sunset. Everything turns dark eventually, and our passports might as well be padlocks. So what would you have the world know? I ask her. In this musty classroom, sitting on 2 plastic lawn chairs meant for children, I ask her, what does it mean to be a refugee youth here? Her eyes flash. She is sharp, witty, hijab worn as loose as her mother will let her, a firebrand who learned English in 6 months and spits it quick and aggressive like the Californian kids she follows on Instagram. I would tell them what I tell you, she says, that I am a refugee, but I am normal, that I am a refugee, but I play football, that I'm a refugee and a woman and a Muslim and I'm not poor. And when they tell me to go back to my country in the makeup aisle, I tell them they are colonizers too. I am normal. I am normal. I am a refugee. I am normal. She is quiet for a second, her chin trembling like broken jello. Home, she says quietly, is palm trees and grandma's house, but I can never go back there. It is America or Australia, whichever will take us first. Home is my family, but I hate it at home. It's on the field, but mom says only boys play football. I am silent, fingers suspended over keyboard like a marionette, not sure if this is for the record or for her. She speaks, her voice a spokeswoman for countless others like her, and none of them at all. I want the world to know I am a refugee, and I am normal, and I like makeup and Instagram, and I want to keep training and play for Barcelona FC one day, the men's team. I want them to know we are not what they say we are, victims or job stealers, resilient or resourceful, but all we are doing is trying, surviving, striving, until the day we finally find our way home.
So what are the next steps in our youth migration project? Well, as I mentioned, we've completed phase 1. This is a multi-sited study, and so we're just in the middle of phase 2, where we're focused on Thailand and youth who are living on the Thai-Myanmar border. And so we're repeating the same method as we did in Malaysia, as organizing young people into peer-mediated storyboard narrative groups. And we're interested in exploring how this method works in a new setting with a different kind of population. On the Thai-Myanmar border, there have been Myanmar people from many different ethnic groups that have been in conflict with the dominant government there for many, many years. So for many years, there's been a large population of Myanmar refugees who live on the border. And so some of the youth there have actually been born into this border community or have lived for most of their childhood or adolescence in the border community. Some of these youth also cross back into Myanmar, just a little bit over the border, repeatedly with or without their families for different kinds of income generation and to visit with family members. So it's a different kind of environment than the environment of the youth in Malaysia, where people had left their country and were not near their country of origin and not returning back and forth to their country of origin. So youth who've grown up as forced migrants in this liminal state of being unrecognized by either country, what will their storyboard narratives be like? So we're asking the same questions about identity, belonging, and future aspirations. And we're also working, in this case, through much more through translators. So there's new learning that will come from phase 2. In phase 3, as I mentioned, we heard from the youth in Malaysia that participating in the peer-mediated storyboard narrative groups had been a kind of intervention for them. They talked about how they started to put order onto the chaos of their migration stories, that they had become interested, more interested in their own story, and beginning to appreciate that they had a unique story to tell that other youth were interested in. And they also formed, many of them said that they had formed new friendships, and that their peer group had become a kind of lasting psychosocial support group for them. Some of the youth said, I never knew that boy had an experience that was similar to mine, or I never knew that girl had gone through such a terrible thing. And they provided a lot of support to each other. So it gave us the idea that that maybe this, actually our team was at a summit for the Sustainable Development Goals in Malaysia, and we were talking about our project with some people from UNESCO and UNICEF, and they said, this sounds like it has the potential for being a kind of low-cost intervention for migrant youth in Malaysia. I mean, low cost in the sense that it didn't rely on very highly trained counselors, it's not therapy, it's not crisis intervention, but that maybe this method has the potential for being something that could be offered to the many forced migrant youth that UNICEF and UNESCO know live in Malaysia. And so it gave us the idea to try out the method as a psychosocial support intervention. And we were able to get new funding from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research of Council of Canada to partner with a migrant serving organization in Thailand called the Swanamit Foundation. And so our phase 3 is exploring the potential of the peer-mediated storyboard narrative method as an intervention to promote self-development, skill development, and psychosocial support for forced migrant youth. This is also, because it's the pandemic, this is also giving us a chance to explore online training. And so we're meeting bi-weekly with our partners in Thailand and talking with them about what they need in order to implement this method without us being on site. And also we're having to figure out all the layers of translation, because there are various people who only speak Thai and English, Myanmar and English, Karen and Myanmar, Thai and Karen. And so it's presenting new challenges that we're working through as a community of learners together. So it's really exciting, and we're looking forward to this, the actual intervention work going into 2021. So we'd like to leave you with some questions to ponder. Nearly everyone has some experience of a geographic shift, like maybe having moved out of a family home into one's own home, or moving from one neighborhood to another, or across the country, or from another country. So nearly everyone has had some kind of geographic move in their life, and may have also had one or more significant social shifts in their lives. So everyone has experienced mobility or being on the move in some way. So how has your own sense of identity been changed as a result of these shifts? How has your sense of belonging changed over time? Where do you belong, and with whom? And how has your sense of these things changed as a result of the shifts or the mobility in your own life experience? And how do you envision your future? And how have your future aspirations been changed as a result of geographic or social shifts? And what has contributed to how you've evolved and grown over time? And what role has mobility played in your own self-development? In terms of the topic for our presentation today, having heard us speak and seen the PowerPoint slides, What more would you like to understand about who are migrants? What are the new questions that may come to mind? And what about Canada's obligations to respond to the global issue of forced migration, especially with respect to children and youth? And what can we do as a community and as individuals to address this issue globally and in Canada? So we'd like to thank you for your interest in this project and in this topic, and encourage you to check out our website, www.youthmigrationproject.com. And also on the website for this lecture series, we're going to, we've provided a what would be a handout in a lecture series, but we've provided an information page. And we're also providing some links to Canadian organizations that do work with refugees and migrants for your interest, and to consider what role Canada might play and how you might play a role in the lives of refugees and migrants. Thank you very much.